Just in time for Halloween, we have the horrors of complexity and how to fix them. First of all, we want to cover and just right up front tell you it's not your supply chain's fault. During the pandemic and since the pandemic has ended, we heard about a lot, and we still hear about, the supply chain is our problem. They're the ones that are causing the extended lead times, significant on-time delivery issues, increased backlog, bloated inventory, quality issues. We basically have been blaming that. We hear that we're blaming that on the supply chain. But we can tell you the cause of these issues is really too much complexity in your business. And it's complexity that is related to products and also customers. But today we're mainly going to focus on the product side. And this complexity was really magnified, the horrors in your business during this time. So today we're going to cover why complexity conspires against you and your business and what to do about it before the next major disruption occurs, because there is going to be another one. So we have to prepare for it. So Mary Kate, what have you seen recently with working with some of your clients?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Mark. I actually was at one client recently that has 90-day lead times, where the industry standard pre-COVID was 20 days. But the organization keeps, kind of pointing at the supply chain as the root cause. And they keep throwing resources at trying to solve it. And as we know, and as they're learning, it's not the supply chain. It's absolutely the complexity within their organization. And I think you and I both know organizations that, entered COVID and did much better because they were already simplified.
Yeah, we have on the other hand, we have clients that simplified their business before the COVID, and they were actually able to pick up business, gain market share during this time when others couldn't ship. And of course, they have kept that business now because they developed a relationship with those customers. So they enjoy that business today. So those are some really good examples. So let's dive in and talk about this in more detail. Here we have this, what we call paranormal activity. What are the signs of complexity? And again, we're going to stress this is not because of your supply chain. The first two, on-time delivery and longer than desired lead times, they're related, but they are two different issues. Mary Kate gave an example of lead times were much greater than the industry standard, much greater than what the customers wanted. So lead times are too long. And on the other hand, even when we have the extended lead times, we're still seeing poor on-time delivery issues, below 80%, below 60%, some even less than 50% on-time delivery. We'll talk later about communication and keeping your customers up to speed. But, those two issues are definitely related, but they are two different issues.
Yeah, and Mark, oftentimes we see too much inventory with our clients, but they're actually experiencing frequent stockouts because they actually don't have the right stuff that customers are ordering. So we see that way too frequently. And I really want to highlight number 4, organizational stress is a real issue with complexity. People want to do a good job, but they've got too much on their plate, and trying to get it all done in a complex organization is leading to stress. And we're seeing this across the board with high turnover rates as well as low engagement scores.
Yeah. So going back to the inventory problem, I call this too much and not enough, right?
Yeah.
We have too much of some things, so our inventory is much greater than it should be, but we don't have the right components in stock. So we're still not able to ship, and our inventory is higher than it should be. And normally when your inventory is too high, you would expect to get better one-time delivery, but we're still having both of those problems, which is certainly not good.
Right.
On the quality issues, this complexity, having too many things to do and too many products to make definitely leads to quality issues, what I call both internal and external. So internally, we're seeing a lot of quality. We have high rejects. And those quality issues they're actually picked up in the manufacturing plant, but it still is extra cost to the organization It also leads to, you're expecting to get 100%, you only get 70% off the line. Now you're going to have delivery issues and so on. And external, this is kind of the worst example, is you actually have those quality issues being shipped to the customer. And so then you're getting complaints, you're getting things sent back, and that's causing a lot of issues with the customer, and customer satisfaction is going down. So quality issues certainly, we saw the complexity and the impact on quality issues during this time. The next one on high non-value added indirect labor in manufacturing. So let me explain what that is on how we define both direct and indirect labor. So first of all, take out all the SG&A, and we're looking at that manufacturing. We're looking at direct labor, defined as the people that actually assemble or make things in the plant, so they're actually touching the product. And then the indirect is everybody else in manufacturing. Typically, they're not assembling or manufacturing parts, but they're everything else, from supervisors, quality, safety, materials management, purchasing, expediters, the warehouse people, fork truck drivers. Those are all indirect labors. And so one of the metrics that we use, and you can do this on your own, is look at the ratio of direct to indirect. And if that ratio is close to 1, that's a real good sign that your operation is too complex. You should have a lot higher multiple of direct to indirect, meaning you don't need as many support people, just telling the people what to do or getting them to do their job. But when that ratio gets close to 1-to-1, which is quite often the case with clients that we've worked with, certainly before we start, that's a true sign of complexity, and it's added cost. So we're going to talk about today, the impact of complexity. The impact is on your income statement and on the balance sheet. So when we talk about the income statement, those costs, this is one area in particular. Indirect labor is too high, and we call that non-value added. You want to minimize that as much as possible. You have to have some, but you want to minimize as much as possible. You probably also have too much direct labor, which is another issue on the income statement. So that whole area in cost of goods sold and the COGS on the income statement we're after. And complexity also drives additional cost in the SG&A. And so we'll talk about that as well today. But on the income statement, the number one issue is inventory, is having too much inventory. It's the biggest part of your working capital that you actually control. And so that inventory is with too much complexity. We have finished goods, work in process, raw materials. We have finished goods, but it's not the ones that are selling. We have work in process that's waiting for parts because of this complexity. And then we have the inventory issues, Mary Kate, that you already talked about, is we have too much of some items and not enough, so we can't make the right products to sell. So those are definitely related.
Yeah, Mark, one of the ones that's probably not as evident in the P&L is wasted new product efforts. This is a huge, huge issue with complexity. Projects take too long or longer than they're supposed to, or projects, come past due, and we lose possible opportunities in the marketplace that way. And I think you did a great job just now of describing all of these and how they all contribute to really below expectations and profitability.
Right. Yeah. And of course, as was mentioned in the introduction, really what we're talking about is the profitability of the existing business, but we're also talking about growing profitably. Yeah. And it's very difficult to grow when you're having these kind of issues. And then there's one other, I left out one other impact on the income statement that's actually related to the balance sheet with this inventory, is we get this grading problem. And we're going to talk about that next, but we have, the inventory grading is actually, and the cost ends up on the income statement. So that's another issue as well. So you see this list, there are probably other issues in your business that are due to complexity, but these are the big ones that we typically see. So if you have one or more, some of you may have all of these or bits and pieces of most of them. This is an area that, there's just, way too much complexity in the business.
Yeah. And Mark, I don't know about you, but I've noticed when somebody has one, they typically have at least 3 or more.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not usually one of these issues. And we talked about how they're they're kind of commingled, right?
Yep.
Okay, so how do we know if we have too much complexity? Some of you have attended these webinars or you've worked with us. You're very familiar with what we're going to go through here. This is called the quartile analysis. We start with the customers. I'm going to show you on the next slide the products and how they're related. But if you haven't seen this before, this is the customer quartile. I'm going to explain how we put it together. And this is something that you can do. So get what we're talking about is 1 year worth of data, start with 1 year, and we want to know the revenue by customer, total revenue by customer for that 1 year. And then we're going to rank them in terms of the largest revenue, customer number 1. And in this example, there are 2,000 customers, but whatever you have, the smallest customer will be the last customer with, say, positive revenue during the year. So don't include those customers that you didn't ship to. These are only the ones that have revenue during the year. So then what we do is we group those customers into buckets or quartiles. So 25% of the customers. So the quartile number 1 has 25% of the customers, but it's the biggest group. It's the largest volume customers. And quartile 4, on the other hand, these are your smallest group of customers, the smallest 500 customers in this example. So when we go to the percent of revenue, the next column, and all these 3 columns to the right, by the way, equal 100%. So percent of revenue, we have done this thousands of times, and the typical distribution of revenue, because we live in an 80-20 world and 20% of your customers generally represent 80% of the revenue, this is actually 25% of the customers, so it's higher. And so we typically get 89%. So 89% of the revenue in quartile 1, and then the rest is split between 89, 7, 3, and 1. So what this means is that the top 50% of your customers generate 96% of the revenue, and the bottom 50% are generating only 4%. So you can see already this creates some tension in the organization if you don't know how to deal with it. And the biggest problem is most companies, certainly before we start working with them, try to and tend to treat customers the same. And so when you're treating customer number 1 the same as customer number 2,000, it creates a lot of extra work on the organization, especially with those smaller customers. So now when we go to the next column, we have what we call the percent of overhead. Or another way to look at it is effort. So take out the direct labor, take out the material cost, everything else is overhead. Manufacturing overhead, SG&A, those are the 2 biggest groups. So now when we look at the percent of overhead or the percent of effort in the organization, what we see, and when we ask people, we get a variety of responses. One of them is that it's actually the reverse of this. It's 13789, and to that we say there's actually no way you can be that bad.
That would be a horror.
You would be. I would tell them you'd be already out of business if you were that bad. And the truth is that it's about 25% in each quartile. And so we're not talking about what is your accounting system allocate to these customers. We're talking about how much effort is actually consumed in each quartile. How much effort does it take to serve these customers? And what happens is the larger customers who are ordering typically all the time, they don't need as much help. And when they place an order, it's for much higher volume. But down in quartile 4, some of these customers only buy once in a while, maybe even once in the year. They don't know what they're doing, so they have a lot of questions. They get all those questions answered, and then they order maybe 1 or 10. They just don't order that much. That's why they're in quartile 4. So they take a lot more effort per dollar of revenue that's being generated. And so when you look at the way the distribution of the effort, it's 25%. Now I'm going to come back and give you another example of this, but for now, let's just talk about the 25%. So now when we go to the percent of profit, if you take your total profit dollars and we look at what is the distribution of your profit dollars by quartile, well, the first thing we find is, and a lot of people have a hard time getting their heads around this, is that the profit your total profit percentage in quartile 1 is greater than 100%. And here we say 150%, but from the work that we've done, this is probably the minimum. Quite often it's 200 or even 300% of the profit.
Absolutely.
And it's that way for a reason, because we're going to talk about the fact that sometimes you have more than 89% of your revenue in quartile 1. Therefore, you're going to have more than 150% of your profit. But if you have 150% of your profit in quartile 1, I think then you realize that, well, then we have to be losing money as we go down the quartiles. And in fact, in quartile 2, we say sometimes you can make money in quartile 2. It depends on the margin, dollars, and the effort, and so on. But you might be able to break even. But in quartiles 3 and 4, you're losing money. There actually is no way. There is no way you can make money with 3% of your 25% of your organizational effort. Doesn't matter what the margins are. Some people get confused by margin percent, but we're talking about the margin dollars because that's what pays for the overhead. And so we're looking at the margin dollars. So you're losing money in quartile 3. You could even be losing money in quartile 2, but let's just say we're breaking even. But in quartile 4, you're losing a lot of money. So what we're after in simplifying the business, reducing complexity, is this 50% of the overhead and effort in the business. And most clients that we work with, most people that have gone through this process, they want to do one of two things or both. And one of them is they want to reduce the overhead to make more money, to make more profit, and or they want to refocus that overhead. Because if we're making all of our money in quartile 1, we should be making sure that we take care of those customers in quartile 1. We should be making sure that we are finding new customers that will end up in quartile 1, that type of effort. And so these are the two things that we typically see in terms of redistribution or reducing the overhead.
I'm curious, as it relates to the profitability in the bottom half of the quartile, we hear from so many people asking, well, I definitely spend more of my overhead and effort in the top part of the quartile than the bottom part. It can't be spread equally 25, 25, 25, 25. How do you answer that?
Yeah, so we have, actually I did an analysis recently, and it was one of these cases where they actually had more than 89% of their revenue in quartile 1. And so, we did I just did somewhat arbitrarily, but said, okay, what if it was 40, 30, 20, 10 in the percent of effort in overhead column? If it was 40%, then 30%, 20, and 10. That's 100% of the distribution of overhead. And in this case, because the revenue and margin dollars in quartile 1 were still higher than 89%, in this example that I took their numbers and plugged them in, they started losing money in quartile 2, and so
even
they
at
still
that
lost
percentage
in 2, 3, and 4, and they were making over 200% in quartile 1 of their total profit. But as we say, it's one thing to make that money, but the challenge is how do we keep it? And this is complexity to deal with the customers. But let me show you, for again those that haven't seen this before. What's lurking in the shadows here is the product side. So what I just went through is on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side in this example, we have 4,000 products. And we do the same thing. We rank them from highest revenue to lowest revenue, put them in buckets of 25% of products, not of revenue. And because we live in an 80-20 world, and 20% of the products generally represent 80% of the revenue, we find the same relationship here, 89-7-3-1. And so when we do the data, again, doing this over and over again, we see this 80-20 relationship in a lot of companies. And I would say more so now, I'm actually seeing that the percentage is higher in quartile 1. I don't know, Mary Kate, what you're seeing, but we're seeing a lot of examples where it's actually higher in quartile 1.
Absolutely. And I'm going to share an example of that in a bit.
Yeah. And so when you have this relationship, so when people get to this, some people have said, hey, why don't we just get rid of quartiles 3 and 4? We can get rid of the customers in quartile 3 and 4. We can get rid of the products in quartile 3 and 4. Well, there's two reasons why that would be a mistake. And the first reason is if you got rid of, now that you have all that overhead, if you get rid of quartiles 3 and 4, you've made it worse. So we can't get rid of quartiles 3 and 4 without getting rid of the overhead. But the other problem is this, especially on the product side. We have large customers, they buy a lot in quartile 1. That's what gets those products into the first quartile. But they also buy some things in quartile 3 and 4. And so if you get rid of those products without looking at who's buying them, you could have a problem with your largest, most profitable customers because they want to buy everything from you. They don't want to have to buy just the high volume stuff from you and then get the low volume stuff somewhere else. So that's why they stay with you. We also have this. We have some low volume customers that buy high volume products, the same products that are being purchased by the quartile 1 customers, but they just don't buy a lot. But we like to keep that business if we can because it's the exact same product. Yeah. So that's why we developed what we call the quadrant. So again, many of you have seen this before, but this is where the devil is in the details here, because now we have the strategic intersection of customers and products. So the A's in this quadrant, the A's are what we call the 80s. So we take that same revenue data. It's ranked from highest to lowest. When the cumulative revenue gets to 80%, we draw a line. Everybody above the line is an A, everybody below the line is a B. We do the same thing for the products. The 80s are the A's. They generate the 20% of the products generating 80% of the revenue. We draw a line. Now we have the strategic intersection in quad 1, for example, of the A products and the A customers. And it's in green for a reason, because this is your most profitable piece of the business. Okay. In order to do this, we need all the transaction data. So this is a little more complicated to put together. And we want as much information as possible, the revenue, the cost, the quantity. We need to know who bought what for this 1 year time frame is usually what we look at. So you can look around the quads, and again, we want to spend too much time here, but you get that strategic relationship of the A customers. But you can see in quad 2, that's those low volume products that they're buying. In quad 3, you have the low volume customers, but they're buying the A products. And in quad 4, which is red for a reason, we have low volume customers buying low volume products. So there's a whole set of actions that but the main goal here is to simplify the business so you can then grow profitably. And you can use the strategies that are developed from working with this data. Okay, so let's get to the horrors of complexity. We have 3 different examples to talk about, and Mary Kate, I think we're going to go to you for the first one here.
Yes, it was really nice of our marketing team to make sure that we've had the Halloween theme, given Halloween's just in a few days. The example I'm going to share is about the haunted warehouse. So I have a client who has way too much inventory, and of the inventory they have, it is about 60% slow moving or obsolete, which is a big percentage. When I visited their manufacturing site in Europe, they had inventory everywhere, filled that plant, but they also had facilities leased locally with more inventory, both finished goods and raw materials. They have distribution centers throughout North America filled with inventory as well. And so really, as we were walking through all of these sites and learning the business, we noticed that the fast moving inventory, Mark, was mixed in with the slow moving inventory, and the obsolete inventory was not segregated out or even disposed of in a timely manner. So as you talked about the income statement, some of it was considered obsolete, written off, and still in the factory or in one of these distribution centers. Yeah. Actually, in the factory, in the manufacturing site in Europe, we actually came across a pallet of obsolete inventory that should have been disposed of that actually had mold well beyond its use date as a raw material. Yeah. So, this creates all kinds of problems for a business. I mean, first of all, it's lost profitability, as you talked about earlier in our discussion. Lost profitability, certainly the most obvious, is to the P&L with product write-offs because of age, or raw material write-offs because of aged inventory. That we can all understand. I think the indirect labor is a big one because it takes time, effort, people to move all that inventory around. And there's a cost to that, but they're also on fork trucks, which have a cost to them. So if you have leased space, you have excess fork trucks, you have, excess people, that is absolutely adding to the cost. But those also add to some other potential problems. I mean, first of all, the risk of safety incidences. Anytime that a fork truck comes near a pedestrian, the level of risk in an organization goes up. So the more fork trucks we have, the higher our risk is for accidents. That is a concerning piece with really high inventory. And the example I gave of the aged raw material, when that's mixed into the overall inventory, the risk of product quality goes up.
Yeah, definitely. And I have a couple of examples too, but the one thing that came to mind as you were talking about that is, we keep talking about the impact on the income statement and on the balance sheet. Well, with all this floor space that's required to keep track of all this inventory, because of the complexity, the floor space is hitting both the balance sheet, right, and the income statement, because you have the cost of the facility, you have the cost of the assets in there, you have the cost of the fork trucks and the fork truck drivers, all that's hitting the income statement. But then you have the assets that are going on the balance sheet, and the building is an asset value that's going on to and it's included in the working capital. So we're talking about the ratio of profit and the working capital. This is called return on invested capital. So this complexity is definitely impacting both the numerator and the denominator when you look at the return on invested capital. And then a couple of other comments. I had a customer. You talk about the inventory is bad enough when it has let's say an infinite shelf life. Mm-hmm. But when you have these, there are some cases where the shelf life is not infinite. It has a shelf life. And I had an example where we had a client we were working with, and they were doing wheels. One of the spare parts they provided were wheels, and these were for off-road vehicles. So they had thousands of parts, of course, but they had these wheels. And so when we took a tour of the warehouse, we noticed that these wheels were being stored outside. And I said, well, what's going on with going on? Why are they outside? Well, what happened was they had an order for, let's say 4 wheels for an off-road vehicle, but the minimum order quantity was 15. And so they had to buy 15 from the vendor. They shipped 4 to the customer. They had 11 wheels left over. And these wheels, because they didn't fit, they were too big to put in the warehouse, they put them outside. And then what they told me, this was not the worst part. The worst part was the wheels sitting outside would rust. And so they would have to send them out to be stripped down and repainted, because they didn't have this infinite shelf life. And of course, when they brought them back, they had to store them outside again. So this would just go on and on, rather than just throwing them away, or better yet, not taking the order for 4 wheels when you don't have a customer or need for the other. So that's one other example where shelf life really can come into play with a lot of different raw material parts, especially. The other one you mentioned, or I think you touched briefly on, was this physical inventory. Taking a physical inventory is, first of all, it's a complete waste of time. It is the biggest non-value added activity that a manufacturing plant can have. And the main reason that you have to take physical inventory is because there's too much complexity. Because, Mary Kay, you and I have both run companies and plants where they don't do physical inventory. And it takes 2 things. I'm not going to say these are easy to do, but it only takes 2 things to stop doing physical inventory. One is you have to have your bill of materials has to be 100% accurate. And your cycle counting has to be nearly perfect, not 100%, but nearly perfect. And if you get those two things right, then you don't have to take physical inventory. But I've worked with, and we have a client that's taking physical inventory twice a year. And that's just completely, to me, mind-boggling as to how we could be, not have control of our operation in order to, we have to do physical inventory twice a year. Because, everybody knows what happens during physical inventory. The plant shuts down, which means you can't ship. And so when I say non-value added, we always define that term from the customer's point of view. This is completely non-value added because they can't even get their products, right?
Now, Mark, that's a really good point. And I actually have a client who pulled their salespeople out of the field to participate in physical inventory. Think of the opportunity cost of that, right?
Yeah.
They're not adding selling time, value to their time.
So you take your most expensive resource and you bring them into the plant to count nuts and bolts. And
yeah.
So the end result of this is on your haunted warehouse is this, right?
It is, simplify the product offering, and it ultimately reduces the inventory, which reduces the working capital, which drives profitability.
Yeah, very good. Okay. So let's go on to this second example, and I'll take this one, that it's alive. The monster of complexity that I see is called the configurator. Now, not all companies use configurators, but many of them do. And, they think it makes it easier on the customers because it allows them to configure exactly what they want. This also applies, and we did have some questions that came in beforehand about, how do you apply these simplification methods in a custom engineered environment? And so, custom engineered environment configurators kind of fall in the same bucket from my perspective. So allowing customers, too much the ability to configure, really adds a lot of complexity to the organization. So recently we had a client that had a configurator. All the options were predetermined, and they, after we got involved with them, they actually ran a model that said how many different variations could we have, not how many have we had or how many did we make. But they did the math and they came up with an octillion possible variations that could be ordered. And I didn't know what that was at the time, but after we looked it up, the octillion is a number followed by 27 zeros.
Oh, wow.
So you can see that this is a very high number of possible configurations. Now, fortunately, they only sold 7,500 different configurations, and these were machines, so they were pretty substantial. 7,500 was a lot. And so what we look at in terms of a configurator is think about the automotive industry. When you go to buy a new car, you go in and they tell you, okay, you need to pick a color, you need to pick from these three options, and then they will either have the car on the lot or they will find the car through their network that gets you as close to what you want to buy. They don't ask you to fill out a blank sheet of paper and check the boxes on a configuration. Now, you can do that, but the two things that are going to happen when you do that, it's going to take a lot longer and it's going to cost a lot more money, because what they're telling you is they want you to buy a car that's already been made. And so think about the auto industry. They're pretty good at this because their business model is to buy something off the lot. And, the car companies have done a pretty good job of putting options together in a package, because that's another way to do this, is having standard packages with a limited number of options. And then you could keep the configurator. So do your standard design, standard machines with a few options that are quick to deliver, better quality, lower inventory, all that, higher moving on your inventory turns. And keep the configurator, but tell them, look, if you go down the configurator, it's going to cost a lot more and it's going to take a lot longer. And you're trying to encourage them to buy something that's already made. And then, of course, the other thing we would recommend is those customers in quartile 3 and 4, we just would not let them use the configurator. These are only for our biggest, best customers in quartile 1 and maybe some in quartile 2.
Yeah.
So doing this, really simplifying the product offering, really eliminates that configurator, to reduce the complexity in the business.
I love that example. I have a project I'm working with a client on now about this very thing. There were 4,000 possible combinations. Over the last 3 years, I think they've sold somewhere around 500 or 600 of those.
Yeah.
And now it's getting down well below 200. And it's just making such a big difference in manufacturing. And the first thing was not offering the configurator to the B customers.
Yeah, very good, very good. Okay, so why don't you take this last example that we have?
Yeah, again, sticking with our Halloween theme, we've got a client where on-time delivery right now is, or when we started working on it, was below 70%. Lead times were double what they had been prior to COVID, and they really thought that it was because of the supply chain, Mark. So, it's just unbelievable how much they thought that this was tied to the supply chain. So when we learned more about this organization, we learned that they had made a bunch of acquisitions over several years. And with each one of those acquisitions, they expected to do product rationalization. Then they got busy and they didn't actually do product rationalization. So when I started working with them, they had, let's say, I think it was about 10,000 products. And we did the quartile, just like you presented earlier. We did the quartile. It was even skewed higher than what you showed. We learned that 93% of the revenue was coming from that top quartile of customers, so that top 25%. Not following the 89,731, definitely higher in that regard. They thought they had too many products, but they were genuinely surprised that such a small number of customers, 2,500, a small number of customers were buying 2,500 products, and that was 93% of their revenue.
Yeah.
It's just really
generally, when you say generally surprised, you mean they were shocked, basically, when they saw this.
They were.
Yeah, and I see that too a lot. We get people look at this data, and it's like, the data's there, but they've never looked at it this way and tried to understand what the complexities, how all that adds up. So this is what you had. What was the end result here?
Well, luckily, they were, like I said, surprised by the data, but they were also motivated. So they wanted to move pretty quickly. And we also saw very quickly that those bottom 5,000 products were just crushing manufacturing. It wasn't the supply chain. It was the plant just couldn't get ahead of that many small product setups. All of that adds up. So this client was motivated to move fast. We moved fast. And within 3 months, we did cut the bottom half of the products, which is aggressive, but we were able to do it. OTD shot up to 90%, which, within 3 months is a quick, but we were able to just, simplify the plant, simplify the offering, and we were able to reduce lead times back to the industry standards.
Yeah. Now, when you said on-time delivery of greater than 90%, was that for everybody, or is this for the most important customers, or were they able to do it for everybody?
No, you're right. We started with the most important customers. Absolutely. We started with the highest volume products and really focusing the line time on those and the most critical customers. And we worked through that. This, by the end of 3 months, it was 90% overall, but you're absolutely right. It was, it
was better for the larger customers. Good. Yeah. And you mentioned about having multiple acquisitions.
Yes.
So are they able to consolidate the space, or is that coming, or where does that fall in the timeline of things going on?
So it's in process now. So they've taken action on one of them, and there's a couple more in the sites. And this is, again, so often part of simplification, where you don't need as much square footage or capacity to be able to supply the highest volume products.
Yeah, good. Good. Okay. Expelling the evil through simplification. We've talked about some examples here, giving you some, how to look at your business and see if it's, more or less complex. The one thing I was going to point out, Mary, when you see 93% of your revenue in quartile 1, what happens to quartile 2 and 3 is usually they're less than 1% combined, because as quartile 1 gets bigger, then 3 and 4 get smaller. So it's not 4% or 3%. It's usually less than 2%. And so it's even a bigger gap between quartile 1 and what's going on in the rest of the business. So these are, simplifying the business. We're not saying it's easy. It is hard to do, but the benefits far outweigh, the effort in terms of the results that you're going to get from doing this. So we talked about, each one of these, the inventory, the impact of inventory. Remember that in every one of these examples, the inventory is going down, but the on-time delivery and lead time is going up, especially for our most important customers. The profitability, through simplification, I would say the number one benefit of simplifying the business is improving the profitability. Consolidating facilities, we just talked about an example and gave examples where, this is where you can start to do more outsourcing and you can start combining facilities, because as you know, there's a certain part of running a facility that is, kind of a non-variable cost of running a facility, and it multiplies by the number of facilities. So keep that in mind. We also talked about reinvesting or freeing up that overhead and investing it in areas other in the business. So we gave, 2 examples here are, freeing up money in the income statement and investing it in marketing and new product development. And of course, when we're talking about marketing, we're not talking about trade shows. We're talking about doing real customer research so that we know what kind of new products to make, and then how can we make sure that when we introduce new products, that they are, hitting the target or reaching the objective of whatever the project is. That improved customer satisfaction. So now we're able to deliver on time. We're able to a much higher rate of delivering on time. We're able to shorten the lead times. So once you're improving the customer satisfaction, we're of course then looking at improving share of wallet, because customers are trying to go anywhere they can to get product. When they realize they get better performance from one of their suppliers, then they typically will give them more business. And so improved customer satisfaction, there's a direct correlation there, as everybody knows, to getting more business. Reducing organizational stress, you brought this up, Mary Kate, in the beginning, is that this complexity drives a lot of stress in the organization. And we start asking questions when we get to know the client about what are your turnover rates. And I'm always amazed by how much turnover they have. And in this environment, when it's so hard to find good people, you would think that reducing the organizational stress of the existing people that you have would be a much better investment than keep doing what you're doing, because the turnover is really tough. It's tough to find people. It's tough to keep them. So getting especially your best employees, how do we keep them? Definitely reducing the complexity can help. And everything that we've talked about here so far is leading to this profitable revenue growth. And so we want to increase the profitability of the business we have, and then we want to grow profitably. And everything we've talked about can certainly help you in those areas. So anything else, Mary Kate, that we?
No, I love this list, and what we, one thing I just reiterate is typically an organization doesn't have one. If they do have one, they have multiple or all of these.
Yeah, the issues that we talked about, and then these, can be the improvement.